I've been trying to understand how Blake created these extraordinary works. Recreating Blake's processes, it is the most effective way of getting back to Blake's studio in the early 1790s. He had an uncanny ability to draw and also to write poetry. Blake's genius was to then facilitate the communication of these two aspirations. I'm Michael Phillips, and I've spent much of my professional life engaged in trying to work out how Blake produced his illuminated books. Blake used the copper plate like a sheet of paper, and stopping out varnish, which is an acid-resistant varnish. It's used to protect some areas with a quill pen or a very fine brush. And training himself to write backwards, mirror writing, he wrote his text and drew his designs in reverse, so that when the stopping out varnish dried and hardened, he could then build a wax dike around the edge of the copper plate, and using that as a bath, pour the mordant, highly corrosive nitric acid. The purpose of the mordant is to etch all the areas except those that he'd protected with the stop-out varnish. The feather is used to stir the nitric acid within the wax dike. Relief etching inverts the intaglio process. Instead of etching the design, the text and image are protected by the stopping out varnish. Thus, after the etching process is completed, those raised surfaces are inked. Blake had a very limited palette, but it was a master as a colorman of being able to mix using these very few 7 or 8 pigments to get almost any color that he wanted. To form the ink, the pigment was then mixed with linseed or a nut oil as a paste. For the inking process, Blake used an ink ball, as it's called, or dabber, just barely touching the delicate relief surfaces. This avoided smudging the shallows, the etched areas, or creating splatters of ink, which are almost impossible to avoid. So the next stage after inking the plate was to wipe those areas that had been smudged or splattered with ink. Blake took much longer to wipe out the shallows than he did to actually ink the surfaces he wanted to print with. The small plates can take up to half an hour, even 40 minutes. The much larger plates can take sometimes an hour or an hour and a half to prepare for printing. A conventional illustrated book involved 2 different workshops. One that printed the letterpress text from above the surface, and the other that printed the etched illustration from below the surface. So there is no physical way in which, using conventional means of letterpress printing and intaglio printing, that both can be printed in the same press. That is at the heart of Blake's innovation. Using the stopping out varnish to write both his text and his design, he could print both in his own rolling press. Blake averted conventional modes of publication, and by implication, and not unwittingly, censorship.